I started to look at all of the indirect ways that we're signaling, that we are doing more with less when it comes to language, all the ways that we don't appear to be communicating anything directly, but we're actually saying a whole lot. And so in almost every mode, I was like bringing that forward. It took me a while to figure that out, but that's what it's about, I think. And I'll just say too, David, the digital makes indirect communication all the more important, I think. Or at least it changes how we practice indirect communication. It gives us more channels for doing that.
What mode of work are you in your life right now? If you don't know the answer, keep listening, because we're going to find out what some of those modes look like. We'll be talking about generational differences at work and in leadership, and the key to effective communication in the workplace, whether that be direct or indirect. Unavoidably, the pandemic is going to come up in this context as well, because it has been such a big part of recent workforce changes, and the future of work is the phrase, isn't it? And to help me do all of this and answer all of these questions, I'm joined by Dr. Craig Mattson. He's author of a recent book called Digital Overwhelm. He writes a newsletter, a Substack called The Mode Switch, and he's also Professor of Communication at Calvin University. He's got some highly relevant and very well told stories, as one might expect from an expert in communication. He's also got some great insights on leadership, communication, the future of work, what modes of work look like, as well as these generational differences. So we're going to talk about all of those things. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you enjoy listening to it. I hope you learned some great tips as well to help you in your leadership at work. Do stick around till the end of the episode, or check the show notes below. Get the link, buy a copy of Craig's book if you can, or at the very least visit his website and learn more things. And don't forget as well about your exclusive discount code to join my online leadership community, Integrity Leaders. All of that and more at the end of this episode.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Craig, welcome to Leading with Integrity. Wonderful to have you on the show. I know it's going to be an interesting conversation. So yeah, thanks for being here.
Both those words matter a lot to me. How to lead, how to do it with integrity. So I'm grateful for your show's concept.
So I'm pleased to hear it. Me too, obviously. Yeah. Well, so let's kick off then with over to you, really. Tell the listeners a bit about yourself, your career so far, your background, what you do today, why you do it, all of those lovely grand vision questions, really.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me into this conversation, by the way. I care about leadership because I've talked to a lot of people who are led. Over the past few years, I have been interviewing dozens of rising professionals, generally in the Gen Z and millennial demographics. I'm a Gen Xer myself, and asking them how they're coping with the intensities of the early 2020s. Actually started to do this out of, like so many people, out of a sort of COVID-related, what do we do now sort of mindset. And so I started reaching out to rising professionals that I knew. That's how I got into this work. But I have been on a journey since basically 2006 of trying to understand how organizations can posture themselves for the good of the world and for the good of their teams and their employees. So I've written a couple of books sort of focused on organizational perspectives on leading with integrity. And then since 2020, I have focused more on the people who are populating those organizations and doing the daily work and, being led, hopefully, with integrity.
Okay, and we'd love to hear more about the books in a minute as well. So what I find interesting, so I probably haven't spoken to as many of them as you have, But there's a question I always ask, especially if I've got a whole room of people, which is like, put your hand up if you ever had a bad experience with a manager or a leader, or you've been through that toxic culture kind of thing. And I don't know if this is a bias because of the rooms I'm in when I ask that question or not. But what I find is at least half of the room will raise their hand at that question. If I ask the opposite question, like raise your hand if you've had a great experience, you've worked for a really good leader, good manager, like inspirational type leader, it's a lot less people raise their hands. Have you had a similar experience? Like, I know it's not a very scientific method, is it? But, or do you think, go, what are your thoughts? Go.
I like your question, and I like the way you kind of flipped it there. That is a mode switch in your questioning. I like that a lot. So that makes me kind of do a little cognitive backtracking. Like, what do I think from the data I've seen? It does seem like my question tilted the conversation in the direction of bad managerialism because I was asking about overwhelm. I was asking about intensity and pressure and stress. And so when they were thinking about leaders, if they came to mind, it wasn't their best traits that were coming to mind. So I did, however, increasingly millennials are the leaders in these organizations. And so I did talk to a number of millennial professionals who were managing teams or who were running companies themselves. And I often felt inspired by the work that they were doing. I don't know if that was because I'm going to guess it's because they had experiences like what you witnessed in those rooms where you asked that question and they determined that they wanted to not be that leader. But yeah, at least what they were reporting and the stories they were sharing indicated that they were trying to practice a kind of humane leadership, attentive, aware of the complexity of late modern life, and just basically responsive to the differentiated needs of their team. So I think that's what I can report from what I saw.
Which is a good answer. I think, you very adeptly acknowledged the biases there.
They're there.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think
one
of the biggest ones, isn't it, is the group you're talking to when you ask the question. So quite a lot of the time for me, it's in a networking room where it's other business owners or solopreneurs. And I think there's immediately a bias there because how many of those people are doing what they do because they've had a bad experience for whatever reason, they don't want to be an employee anymore. So immediately there's a potential bias there.
I did not know this at the time, David, but I was talking to people during the Great Resignation. I was doing these interviews during that season, and it took me embarrassingly long to figure out, oh yeah, that's what's going on right now. But it was a very fortuitous time to be interviewing people about vocation and work and career because they were all reconsidering it. They were all weighing, and not all of them, but many of them were in a kind of massive vocational reconsideration. And during the Great Resignation, we saw a bit, let me say, of condemnation for various generational standpoints. Looking up or looking down, people were pretty frustrated with the narrowness of standpoint from leadership or from the team, from the Xers and the boomers who loved their work too much, and the Zs and the millennials who wanted to detach and certainly didn't want to return to office, don't want to return to office. So, yeah.
I mean, first of all, that sounds like an incredibly interesting time to be doing that kind of research. I'm almost jealous. Secondly, so the generational question comes up quite a lot in conversations I have about leadership. We've had a few episodes that almost 100% focused on just that question. And part of that is because I find it really interesting. I also find it on occasion quite frustrating because I think it's very easy, isn't it, to just look up someone's age and then classify them on that basis, right? You're going to behave this way because you are a boomer, or you're Gen X, or you're a millennial, and so on. There's a whole list, isn't there? And I think I'm not disputing there is some value in those generalizations sometimes. And I think if you're doing like wider research, such as the work you're doing, I understand why it makes sense in that context. How do you think we can move away from that on the individual basis in a team as a leader of a business or a business owner, from just like pigeonholing people based on, I mean, it's not just age and generation, is it? But let's focus on that for now. And avoid like those sort of, they're not sweeping assumptions, are they? But they are assumptions. Yes,
we do love to lump things. It simplifies a really complicated landscape.
Absolutely, yeah.
In my recently published Digital Overwhelm, it's always dangerous to talk to authors. They'll bring up their recently published book all too often. But in that book, Digital Overwhelm, where I kind of process what I heard from Gen Zs and millennials about work culture today, the generational thing is a bit of a hook. Everybody's worried about it. Everybody's concerned about it. It's like a presenting problem in work culture is kids these days, or why don't the boomers retire finally? But it's a bit of a hook. You're right. Like it's what do you call that? It's like a slate pitch, or, it's something that invites people to clickbait. But as soon as you click on this, you immediately find that even among the most coherent, cohesive cohorts in any given demographic, there's a remarkable diversity of postures towards work. And so I had a chapter in my book called Meaning Things, in which I just explored the different ways that people use their work for the purposes of meaning making. And I noticed at least 4 postures towards work. And I have played with the labels on these. So I just published an article in in a peer-reviewed journal, and I changed the labels because I went back to the data and thought about it again. But so these are a little bit fluid categories, but the 4 postures that I saw, and there were more, but those were 4 that were sort of preponderant. Included people who use their job to, in some way, solve social problems. They're like, my job helps me make the world better, even in small ways. And that was a little under a third. A surprising number of people were pretty aspirational in their work. Another group saw their work as a way to care for people. That sounds similar, but they had a more therapeutic posture, almost like a pastoral posture or a chaplaincy in their workplace. I am here for my team, in other words, for their development, their formation, their well-being. And then a third group I called the deconstructionists. And these were people who had deconstructed from the religion of what Derek Thompson calls workism today, where work is where you get your meaning. And these people were like, no, it's not going to give me meaning. I remember one woman saying, this is going to sound very atheist of me, but my job has no meaning. And I love that way she was like interacting with the religion that we infuse our jobs with so often. And then the last group, in some ways the most disempowered group, basically saw their jobs as a kind of theater. Like they had to pretend to be cheerful and hopeful and optimistic about their work, even though they were just doing it because they needed the check. So yeah, there is a remarkable variation in how people posture towards work, even though all of these people more or less fit in 2 simple demographics. I named 4 postures. I could easily have named far more.
And so those 4, or however many, they're common across all the generations, are they?
Well, I don't have the data to suggest that. I suspect that. I was only interviewing a certain, Gen Z. Basically, it was ages 22 to 40. And I called them quarter lifers, which is a term I've seen used by some psychotherapists and so forth. But yeah, I suspect, like I could recognize some of those postures in myself. I don't know. What about you? Like, where would you find yourself? Would you be like which posture did?
Yeah, so that 22 to 40, I mean, that's a couple of generations, isn't it, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm in the oldest element of one of those generations.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But so as you were describing those four, I mean, there's at least three of those that I recognize in myself that I have been at various stages of my career. So there's an interesting point there as well, isn't there? Because even if you fit into one of these boxes or categories at some point, you might not be in the same one next year or
Very
in a
good
decade.
point. Yeah.
So that's an interesting one too.
Yeah.
Which I think further underlines the point about don't do it based on generations, right? Because
right.
that it's going to change. But I mean, certainly I've been through the stage of I pretty much hate working here, but I'm staying for the people.
Yeah.
The deconstructionist bit, I've probably been there as well towards the end before I left and became my own boss. The other two, possibly, early in my career, I was definitely in that kind of I've drunk the Kool-Aid kind of stage. In the nicest possible way. But I really like that framework, though. It's a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Good.
I'm going to have to get the book.
And I appreciate your point about the sort of, I don't know, what would like the social scientists might call it, like the longitudinal nature of this. Like if you are a Gen Z just out of college, you might be, I just got to keep this. I got to smile all the time because I got to keep this job because I got to pay my tuition bills. And if you're an elder millennial, you've done some living. This is not your first rodeo. And so, you might be more of a skeptic. But I think I wish I'd thought of that point. I think that's a good observation to make.
Yeah. So there's something in there as well about like, is it a linear progression between the four as well? Or do you go back and forth, or do you start at one and work back? Like, is it always the same pattern repeating?
Yeah. I think something I've been thinking lately on that vein is the Great Resignation went on from 2021 to 2023, roughly 4 million people a month quitting their jobs or switching their jobs. It felt so huge and weird at the time. But now that we're through it, it just feels like another point in an all too narrow oscillation that the American workplace is just always doing. Like there are these moments where we're like, work could mean something. I'm going to switch my job. I'm going to get a new job. I'm going to go to grad school. I love that stuff, by the way, because I teach in grad school. So I need people to say that. But that's what was going on in the Great Resignation. People are like, why am I working in this sucky job? Let me do something that's meaningful, that I care about, that's closer to my identity and that works with my family life. Well, now we're in what journalists are calling the Great Detachment. I don't know if that label's going to stick. It sounds like it might not. But today the American worker is, kind of back where they were before 2020 in so many ways. And so they're showing up at work and managers are reporting that their workers are disengaged. They're doing the stuff maybe, they're doing the things, but they don't care. They don't show that they care. And they're taking a minimalist approach to work. It feels like an oscillation. And I feel like one of the things we have to do is stop that oscillation, stop the kind of perpetual movement between two really narrow extremes. It's just such a narrow band of feelings to have about work. I resent it, or I am absorbed and I'm compulsive about it. Like we can do better than that. We need more feelings about work. So that's something I've been thinking just this morning.
No, I totally agree with that. It's it feels quite cyclical as well, doesn't it? Within individuals, I mean, not like the whole market trend sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, the point about not caring about your job, I mean, everyone goes through that at some point in their career, I think, where you're not in the job that you necessarily want because you don't necessarily want to be there. It's quite hard to care about it when you are there. But also you feel stuck there for whatever reason. Might be, you feel the pressure of the bills and you just can't risk losing that paycheck or whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of factors that play into people's lives in that regard, aren't there?
Right.
And then you change job eventually for whatever reason, and it's new and it's exciting and it's a change and you feel like you've taken control of your career a little bit, and so you you really buy into that and you go too far the other way, and it's just work is everything and nothing else matters. Mm-hmm. And you're right, there has to be a more comfortable middle ground where you can balance caring about your job with not making it the main and most important thing in your life.
Right.
And I think the other thing when it comes to caring, I think that is like trust, it's like respect. It needs to be reciprocal. So a lot of these managers, and there's some quite high profile business owners in recent year or two who have been, decrying the talent shortage and nobody wants to work and all this kind of nonsense. I think it's nonsense, I should say. I feel like if you want people to care about their jobs, then you've got to show you care about them. Why should anyone care about your work that you're giving them if you don't care about them?
No answer on that one.
Yeah, it's one of those things I think we overlook sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I don't want to turn managers into therapists. I think that's it's not a really accurate way to describe the leadership role, but there are sort of pastoral dimensions to the work. There are ways that we're trying to at least attend to how people are making sense of their lives. And if there's a way we can give people a leg up at work, like that's to the good. I remember this, it was a president of a company that I interviewed during the pandemic. And he told me that right in 2020, they started to lose clients massively because they were in a digital experience company. And it was one of those services that companies felt were, well, it's pretty expendable right now. Like we got to focus on what we're making or the services we're providing, and we're just going to get by somehow. So they were leaking customers all over the place. And he was in a relatively small company, like 35-ish employees. And, he was riding the elevator up one morning, thinking about his team, thinking about how they must be feeling, scared, unhappy, a little despairing. And he had a background in ministerial work before he went into sort of for-profit business. Long story, right? But he, his instincts were, when he saw pain, to go towards it. And like, how can I help? How can I be here with you in this time? And that morning he said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to sit down next to my team and say, how are you feeling? How can I be with you right now in this moment of emotional turmoil? Instead, he said, what can our company do right now to give? And that question then provoked him to sort of muster the team for a kind of philanthropic project, I guess. They decided to provide some free services to organizations that were, the services were in their wheelhouse. And the team was energized by this, animated. They had a project to do. They had a thing to work on. They cared about it. It was driven by a value of generosity rather than fear or scarcity. And the company actually got clients out of the deal. So I think I do think it's important to be, sort of mindful and present to your team. But I think there's, leadership also entails that kind of big picture question asking, like, how can we give here in this moment when everybody is just afraid and taking? So that's a story I recur to a lot. The company is Highland Solutions in Chicago, and they're just a really amazing firm doing really, really good work. And I think it's because they ask questions like that, or their leadership asks questions like that.
I love that story.
It's good.
I mean, I would agree with you. I don't think we want to make managers or even like top CEOs and leaders into therapists. But I think there is, and that's a great example of how to walk this line, I think, as well, because you're still, as you say, you're finding a way to give in a way that inspires your people, which can be helpful in times like that. Mm-hmm. But I think there is that line to walk where at the furthest extreme end of that scale, you've got things like, I'm not sure what the laws are like in the States about this, but in the UK, there's a legal duty on employers to provide a safe working environment, for example. So there is, to a point, there is a legal duty to ensure the well-being of people.
Oh, yeah.
I might argue that doesn't go far enough, and that it should consider things like workplace stress and more than just physical well-being, but that's besides the point to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the two ends of that scale, again, we're trying to find a way of meeting in the middle, I think, where you go far enough that you're providing a supportive and safe environment in various aspects, physical, mental, burnout, all of those kinds of things. But you're stopping short of spending your entire time in one-to-one therapy sessions with all of your people. Because I don't think anyone wants that either, employees or employers.
What are you doing, sir?
Yeah. Providing a benefit that includes access to therapy, though, on the other hand, might be a better way to go. So, and again, like when times are tough and we look for, as business owners, thinking about revenue and the bottom line, again, it's human nature. It's a natural thing. What's easiest to cut? What can we stop spending on that isn't going to affect business coming in? And unfortunately, it's things like that, isn't it? It's the staff perks, in inverted commas. But I think, and I don't know. I mean, there's a lot that's been written about the Great Resignation and the causes behind it. My feeling is that it was the two biggest factors were everyone was suddenly working from home, and so that caused a bit of reflection about, this is what it could be like. Plus, I think there were quite a few that moment of crisis, if you like, the sudden global pandemic. It makes you reflect, doesn't it? And I think those are probably the two biggest causes, if I had to pick a couple. Yeah. But I think another aspect of it was this, in some industries who perhaps didn't handle the whole situation as well as they could, I think there was a big element there as well of people saying, well, actually, maybe companies should be looking after us a bit better than that. Maybe I am entitled to more than just a paycheck and not very nice language at work. Wait, what do you think? Am I drawing too many assumptions there, or?
I have puzzled through the potential causes for that the high job quit rates. I have a question for you, I guess. Were they similarly high in the UK? I've tended to pay attention to the American workplace.
In numbers, probably not, but percentage, maybe. It was definitely enough that it was on the radar, though.
Yeah, I think one of the first scholars I read about the Great Resignation was Italian. So I know it wasn't just an American phenomenon, but I tend to be, unfortunately, it's a national trait, Americanocentric. But I think your diagnosis makes sense. I tend to like to see the phenomenon as an overhaul in our thinking about work. We spend a lot of time working, and I don't just mean 9 to 5. Like our toil is just integral to human life, whether we're caring for children or caring for our elderly parents, whether we're doing the Sisyphean tasks of being a citizen, or whether we're, just trying to get along with, the emotional labor of getting along with our neighbors when none of us is feeling our best. I think toil is just really integral to what it is to be human. And so I tend to like seeing movements in the labor market in terms of like just becoming aware of that and doing some recalibrating. I do think that if a macroeconomist were sitting in here, she would identify 6 other sorts of explanatory features for why these labor market cycles happen. And probably every one of them is in the mix. I'm not an expert in macroeconomics, and I don't think that way. And so I tend to look at the sort of more philosophical or reflective or mindful aspects of movements like this. for good or ill. That's what I tend to do.
Yes. Maybe it's just a question of scale, but I feel like the Great Resignation was unique. I can't think of certainly not in my lifetime, and maybe not in the amount of history I've studied. I can't think of another example where there was that level of people leaving their jobs by choice. I mean, there's things like, Great Depression and stuff like that where it wasn't their choice, but that's different, isn't it? So I don't know. There was something unique about it, I think. And no, I can't comment on the macroeconomics either. Nor do I want to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, every discipline exaggerates its capacities for explaining what's going on. I'm a communication scholar, and so I tend to think about language and meaning and discourse and, organizational practices. And I just think that can explain everything, David. But if Larry Summers were here, he would probably beg to differ. So, do you have a disciplinary background? Like, do you have have you studied or spent your most time in a particular field?
I mean, I have two. One is my bachelor's degree was in politics, so we'll set that aside. All that means really is I find politics quite interesting, but I try not to talk about it too much. And then more recently, I did a master's in business and management, so specialising in leadership. Hence,
which is a kind of micro politics, right? Like organizations have their own little societies.
It is and it isn't. Yeah, I guess it is in the sense of it's humans and interactions and relationships, isn't it? I don't like to connect the two too often. Although, again, it's really difficult, especially in recent years. There's been some really interesting things happening in politics. Agree with them or not, love them or hate them. As a study of leadership, there's some great material there.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's right.
There's definitely some lessons to be learned.
Yes.
But yeah, I do consciously try and steer away from that because it just gets too divisive, too politicized.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so.
Yeah. I'm not going to say any more about that. Let's go back to the generational question. Let's come back to that because, again, I find it really interesting. There are now, is it 4 or 5? I've heard both, but 4 or 5 generations in the workforce at once. And I think that's the first time that's happened historically as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I remember, and I'm not sure if this was just a commenter or whether it was an interview participant, but commenting on the fact that she didn't want necessarily to come to work, or her younger cohorts didn't want to come to work, but her older, more seasoned colleagues didn't ever want to quit their work. And so can we do the math here? We have the sort of boomer. Do we have some greatest gen people or the silent generation working in the workforce?
I mean, maybe. I can't imagine it's a high percentage though.
Yeah. So then we have Xer, Millennial, Z, and then Alpha is coming up. Is that what you were thinking of, Gen Alpha?
Possibly.
High school.
Yeah. So I mean, it's definitely 4, isn't it? But then, so it was a couple of episodes ago, somebody left a comment because we were talking about this issue again. And the statement was made that it was 4 generations. And it was corrected to 5 in the comments. I need to dig more into that. I should have researched it before we started, really.
Yeah. It's conceivable that there are some, even, some of the silent generations still doing some jobs here and there. And of course, high schoolers do get into the workforce. So, yeah, maybe that's what the person was thinking of.
Yeah. So maybe it's 6 then. So, I mean, in the context of what we've been talking about so far then, with that many generations at once, it's the first time that's been an issue. What are your thoughts on how we make that workspace function? Because, I mean, without putting people in boxes, there are very different experiences there between all of those generations. They've lived through different things. They have different outlooks on things, and they're probably all at different stages of those 4 examples you gave us earlier about
That's
the way
right.
they view work.
Right. I guess I have two things to say. First, we already know how to do this. We need to do it. Relating across lines of difference is something we've been doing since kindergarten. It's fairly elementary moral awareness and practice. It comes down to things like, respecting the other, listening carefully before you speak, not flying off the handle, all the stuff that your parents tried to impress upon you with your siblings or with your peers in the classroom. But on the other hand, there is a sense in which we're constantly having to relearn this stuff. And I was talking with a guy who sort of styles himself as a communication coach, I think it was a week ago, and I was like, do people need that still? I mean, I'm in that field, so I'm like, I was asking with real economic interest, but I was like, hasn't this been sort of saturate in the market? And he said, no, like people keep forgetting, people keep having to learn it over again. And so I think that's the first thing to say, is that we know what to do when it comes to intergenerational difference. We can do this. It's not macroeconomics. It's pretty ordinary human morality. But we also have to be reminded about it. And so I'm grateful for all the people who are doing that work. It does feel like Sisyphus. You kind of push the boulder up the hill, it rolls back down, keep pushing. The second thing I wanted to say is something, again, that I was just kind of mulling over this morning as I was thinking about, what's it like to have all these generations in the workplace? I think it's a gift. Because in a way, all right, so I'm going to say something a little bit, I don't know, sort of quasi-philosophical. I don't have a license. I'm not a philosopher, but time is weird. That's just an ongoing fact of our experience. We say things like, where did this day go? Or why is this day going so slowly? Or it's already Thursday. We're always like weirded out by time. And I think that a part of the reason that it's so strange is it's always so layered. Like we feel the past in the present, and the future is always somehow there too. And trying to deal with that is like a part of what it means to be human, trying to deal with the weirdness of time. So I think that intergenerational exchange actually just compels us to deal with that weirdness, not flatten it out and ignore it, but like we have the past, we have the present, we have the future, and they're all in the same space. And so I think that's a gift. I think it's a way that we can actually more fully realize our humanness. What do you think of that idea, David? I just sort of cooked that up this morning when I was mulling over this. I think mostly people think of intergenerational stuff as like a pain, but I think it might be a gift.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely a gift. I don't really understand. Well, I say that. That's probably not true. I was going to say I don't really understand why people find it so difficult, or why it's seen such a burden, even, isn't it? But actually, I kind of do, because it's that difference, isn't it? Of, again, it's really hard to talk about it without putting people in generational boxes, which I hate doing. But there is that thing, isn't there, of like the younger, the up and coming generation, and there's the impatience of youth, and always viewing the older generation as moving too slowly and stuck in their ways. And I mean, that's a massive stereotype in both directions. But I think that's where the tension comes from, is people getting stuck with stereotypes like that in their mind and not being able to get out of that and just view people as people, which is what they are, and start with that. And then have that conversation as you say, in the way that we all know how to do. We're all brought up to do that, to speak to people who have different experiences, because every individual has different experiences. If we couldn't do that, we'd never have a conversation with anyone. So it feels basic, doesn't it? And yeah, it is a gift, because it gives you that opportunity to benefit from, to access, to understand those different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we talk about this in the context of leadership and teamwork. Like, if you want to be a successful leader, if you want to have a productive team, you have to be able to do that. And it's not just generational differences either, it's any differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's my take on it. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that sort of resonates with you.
Absolutely.
I run a podcast that works with an intergenerational team. And something I've learned consistently from the boomer is the sheer joy that his name is Ken, takes in being in the company of young people. So he can, he has the sharpest edged, sort of takes on things. But at the same time, he takes the most joy in it too, of just being with the future, so to speak. And even though he carries so much of the memory of the past into the present, he really, really enjoys the layeredness of that experience. And it's kind of helped me to notice that. There's a poet I really like named Jack Gilbert. And I think he was writing in the sort of late 20th century, like the 70s and 80s. But he has this line in a poem called Scheming in the Snow where he says, or he has a character in the poem say, there is a time after what comes after being young, and a time after that. And I love the way that he gets at the strangeness of the way you think life moves in this kind of, I don't know, very simple fashion. From this to this, then that. And this character in this poem had a sense of, no, there's a time after that too, and it's its own thing. So I think that's what's got me thinking about just being in the company of people who are different from you is difficult, and it's a gift. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it can be so rewarding as well if you can handle it the right way. Yeah, I mean, I have to say as well, like your thoughts on time are interesting as well. I'm kind of simplistic about it. I just rely on, like, time is relative, isn't it? So when you're young, it feels like there's all the time in the world. And then when you get a bit older, that same amount of time seems less somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's a lot of difficult and struggling metaphors around that. Like, sometimes it helps me to think of it in terms of like a hard drive, like the capacity of a hard drive. And like when it's completely empty, like 2 terabytes seems like loads. But when you're halfway through, suddenly it feels like that's not as much, is it? And in the same way, like the older you get, the faster time seems to pass. For me anyway. I don't know. And I feel like that's just a simple function of the amount of time passing relative to the amount of time I've experienced. Therefore, it seems like it's a smaller number. But maybe I oversimplify it. I don't know. I'm certainly no Einstein.
It's one of the biggest questions, right? What is time? How does it work? So that's why I just say it's weird. It's constantly weird. And I don't think we want to lose track of that weirdness. I think it actually enriches your life to like live in the weirdness of time. And I think also like toil is just about, I don't know, it's one of the only ways we have of really experiencing that fullness and that richness. Usually we miss it, but it's there. It's there. And toil gives us access to it in a strange sort of way. But that's probably enough philosophizing from a non-philosopher. So
I think everyone is a philosopher to an extent, but maybe that's too philosophical. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, so another thought on the weirdness of time, though, it's that thing like when you're having fun, time goes faster, and when you're not enjoying it, it feels like forever. And then there's also that other. Have you ever experienced this where you have like a really difficult thing that needs doing, or you've had a really tough period at work, or it was really challenging, or you've done a course and you didn't really enjoy it at the time, but then you look back on it and you're like, actually, that was really good. I'm glad I experienced that. That's a weird thing with time as well, right. I think.
Right. And then another strange thing about work and time is, how do you say this? It's like, sometimes I get this panic. I think this happens a lot for me, like a time panic of, I don't have the time that's needed for this particular task. And then I get into the work this strange thing happens, like there's an elasticity to the moment or something, and you finish the task and you were like, it didn't take as long as I thought it would, or its relationship to the available time was just hard to predict. And so I that's why I'm always like, or that's why recently I've been thinking about, how do we live in time when we're working? How do we deal with that sort of mysteriousness? There's a British guy I've been reading lately. Maybe you've heard of Oliver Burkeman. He's famous for a book right now called 4,000 Weeks, that is the sort of average lifespan of a human. You get 4,000 weeks. If you're lucky, you get maybe, a little over 4,000. And yeah, his sort of paradoxical insight is that if we don't look away from the limits of our life, if we don't look away from the inevitability of our death, we actually can live more richly and more fully. It's when we avoid looking at our limits and our mortality that we actually kind of struggle more. So I'm not sure I'm saying the insight with the kind of eloquence that Berkman does. I highly commend his stuff. It's really great. He's got a newsletter called The Imperfectionist that's really, really delightful. So I'm learning from you guys in the UK. That's great.
That's an interesting one. Yeah. I mean, as you were talking about the time versus the work to be done, the project manager in me was just having flashbacks of like time estimation and the angst that always used to cause.
Yikes.
It's impossible, isn't it? Like you ask someone, even if they've done it 100 times before, you ask them how long it will take, and they won't be able to give you a straight answer. But I tend to have the opposite problem to you, though. I underestimate the amount of work I can do in a time.
Well, that's, to me, that feels like a nice counter. But yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like it gets me in trouble sometimes, but given your area of expertise, I think we should talk about communication a bit more. So one of the things that I know you mentioned, you've talked about in the past, is this idea of indirect communication. So first of all, for clarity, anyone who might not know what that means, what does that mean? And then, what do you think its role should be in everyday work versus maybe what it actually is? I don't know. But
yeah. Well, you've taken this interview to a new level, and I commend you for pulling out what was, for me, like the core concern in my book, Digital Overwhelm. I don't think I've had anybody else put their finger on it with that kind of directness, but that is at the heart of that book. In Digital Overwhelm, I lay out 6 what I call modes of communication. They're approaches or styles of communication. And in every case, I try to look at the ways that particular mode, which might be like a mode of conversation like we're having right now, or it might be a mode of sending something to an audience, or it might be a mode of performing, or it might be a mode of advocating. Those are the kinds of modes I'm discussing. And in each case, I explore the strengths and weaknesses of the mode. They all have their uses. But what I found rather late in the project was that I was saying the same thing over and over again. I've heard it said that every book should be an article and most articles shouldn't be written. But the article that my book probably should be is just be aware that a lot of our communication is indirect. So direct communication is what we usually think of when we think of communication. We think of something like sender transmits message to receiver. Receiver sends feedback. A very sort of cybernetic or systematic approach to communication. It's pretty functional, and it seems to describe a lot of what's going on. We often are sending things, we're often receiving things, we're often sending things back. So that's valuable as far as it goes. But again, if you want to get at the human and relational and moral dynamics, even the spiritual dynamics of the workplace, you really have to talk about something besides sending and receiving. And so that's why I started to look at all of the indirect ways that we're signaling, that we are doing more with less when it comes to language, all the ways that we don't appear to be communicating anything directly, but we're actually saying a whole lot. And so in almost every mode, I was like bringing that forward. It took me a while to figure that out, but that's what it's about, I think. And I'll just say too, David, the digital makes indirect communication all the more important, I think. Or at least it changes how we practice indirect communication. It gives us more channels for doing that. It raises the complexity and in some ways makes the rules for how to communicate more obscure. People are always offended by practices that other people have in their communication. And it can be really hard to like explain why you're mad about that. But probably there's been some breach of a rule of indirect communication that you had. Like everybody should do this. And somehow, yeah, that person's not doing it. So anyway, that's why indirect communication was so important to me in this book.
I'm going to offer a couple of examples and you tell me if I've misunderstood. And this has come from a conversation I was having with a friend of mine this morning, actually. We were lamenting someone else's behaviour, and it will make sense in a minute. So in the pre-COVID face-to-face days, one of those, I think, indirect communications, which I was always getting angst for doing, and it was just how I felt comfortable with meetings, particularly in our office that was always cold, was crossing your arms in front of you. And that was seen as apparently like closed posture, negative and aggressive on occasions. Actually, it's just because my arms get cold and that's a good way of warming them up. It had nothing to do with anything else. Exactly, yeah. So I just naturally do it and always have. So, I mean, I guess that's one example maybe of an indirect sort of communication that is easily misinterpreted.
Yes.
And then the one that I was talking about this morning, in the digital age, in the post-COVID, in the remote work environment, it's not having your camera on.
Yeah.
Which we think, in our conversation this morning, I won't tell you who it was with because he probably wouldn't thank me for naming him, but we think that is now rude in the modern age. What do you think?
So the crossed arms first.
Okay.
That is a good little story there. And it's a reminder of something that's easy to forget in what you call the digital age. We're not just talking heads. Right now, you and I have a pair of talking heads on a screen, and we're hoping that some people are willing to engage our talking heads. But we are always more than that. And indirect communication takes us into Kenneth Burke, who is like a mid-20th century linguist, said we are symbol-using animals. And it's hard to keep both those things in mind. We're symbol users. That's what we're talking about, all this language stuff. But we're also embodied creatures. We're animals. And so when you cross your arms because you're cold, that's like, that's a sort of creaturely part of you stepping forward. But because we're also symbol-using creatures, like the coworkers are interpreting that and like, why is David doing that? Is he actually antagonistic to what I'm trying to say right now? So, it's a mess. It's a whole thing, right? But my sympathies for cold workspaces. It's nice to hear. This is sometimes a gendered conversation, I think. I've read some work saying that offices are often like set to the temperature comfortable for a man in a suit or something like that, and aren't adequately reflective of women's wear. And so I don't know if that's a bit of critical theory there, but that's a critique that I've heard brought. So it's nice to hear you like identifying with your women colleagues saying it is cold in here. So.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. I mean, if I'm being 100% honest, there were also occasions where it's because I was a little bit angry about something, just to really muddy the waters. But I think for the most part, I tended to express anger in other ways than crossing my arms as well. So,
we're never doing just one thing. Yeah. The camera thing on Zoom is interesting. I'm a teacher, so I I was teaching during COVID, it was really difficult because we were all like making up the rules as we went. And it was really difficult to discern what to do, what to require, what to mandate. And I tended to be lax in that regard because I just didn't know what's going on. That's my sort of researcher side. Like, I don't know what's going on, so I'm not going to say anything yet. And I heard from some people that in some cases there were racial dynamics in what you were willing to put on screen or not. And especially in the American scene, I can't really speak for the UK on that, but what shows up in the lens of your webcam, I think you call that the frustrum, something I learned by writing this book. The sort of line of sight for what's showing up on your webcam. Like there are class signifiers there. There are things you want to keep private there. There are just matters of personal comportment that might be appropriate for camera and might not. I have a very quick story, but it was a powerful story for me. A Haitian American woman, a professional in Chicago at the time. And she was in a kind of a workshop online with some white colleagues, and it touched on matters of race. And she found herself abruptly triggered by what she was seeing in this apparently, relatively innocuous DEI training seminar. And she was weeping, so she turned her camera off. And part of what was making her weep was the kind of blasé facial responses of her white coworkers to the same material. It grieved her. And so when she turned her camera back on, she said, I put on what I call the face. And she showed me what the face was like. And it was pretty majestic. It didn't communicate a lot except for, you and I are not on the exact same page right now, so don't be too intimate with me. I'm in a different place than you right now. I'm going to show up, I'm going to do the work, I'm going to be here. But I don't want you to assume that because my camera's on and because you can see my face, you know my life. You know what my life is like. And so, I thought that was an interesting indirect piece of communication. Working with a camera and sometimes having to work off camera because she was weeping. So I ponder that story a lot. I think about that story a lot when I think about, should I have my camera on or should I have it off?
Yeah, I mean, that is a very telling story, isn't it? You've gone into way more depth than I did this morning. But so one thing I would add, which I maybe should have clarified at the beginning, I think we in this conversation we were having, we made an exception for during the COVID times, because I think that was a very different picture to how it is today.
Mm-hmm.
Then people didn't have a choice. They hadn't had time to prepare. It was all very sudden, uncertain. And a lot of people, for example, like they were having to work in their kitchens or their bedrooms. And at that point, absolutely fair enough. I don't hold that against anyone. I probably would have done the same. I think today, a few years later, when the technology's moved on, when you can have a virtual background very easily or even just blur it,
mm-hmm.
And when you've had probably the time, especially if you're in a remote working job,
mm-hmm.
at the very least, you can clear your background.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? So I think today, it's a different,
mm-hmm.
maybe a different answer to how it was then. So I completely agree with everything you've said.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some clear sensitivities there, definitely, we should all bear in mind.
If we were in this conversation and I had my camera off and you could hear the sound of, I don't know, carrots being cut and a salad being prepared and there's a certain
funny
kind
you
of
mention
blatant
that has happened to me. Yeah, not on a podcast, thankfully. That would have been too weird.
Do you feel like we have moved more towards a wider shared set of norms about the remote meeting etiquette, so to speak? I think we have. It feels like.
I mean, in my experience, yeah. But then I'm pretty much 100% remote in everything I do now. So.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think that's an advantage. I mean, it's like what we were saying earlier about the generations in the workforce. It's a gift, isn't it? Because, I mean, this conversation wouldn't happen if we had to do this face-to-face for a start, because we're on
That's right.
opposite sides of the planet. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity, isn't it? And I just don't get people who, business owners particularly, who just refuse to engage with this and insist on everyone back to the office and things like that. It's just makes no sense to me.
I think there's a lot
emotionally,
of
it makes no sense to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of unadmirable feelings at play. It seems like.
Yeah.
I know I'm being dismissive, but it does seem like there's a bit of fragility at play. I need to have you here. I need to see you. I need to see you working. I will say though, David, like again, to refer to my boomer team member here on the podcast, he is very much a workplace guy, and he said, I am in favor of return to office because I'm in favor of in-person community. And so I know that's not the end of the conversation, but it's a perspective I try to keep in mind. There probably are some good motives at play too. There are probably some good things that people are seeking in that return to office.
Yeah, I don't doubt that at all. And yeah, I mean, I see both sides of it. I mean, like, my business wouldn't exist if I had to do it all in person. But I also think, like, this idea of face-to-face has evolved now. I think this is face-to-face in the modern context, for example.
Yeah.
But yes, there is huge value always in getting everyone in the same room if you can, if it's practical. But I just don't think it's necessary anymore, if it ever was, frankly.
It's very strange that I think the social science on this is that I read this again. I don't reference Derek Thompson earlier in our conversation, but he cited a study that showed that remote collaborative teams are improving in their productivity and have, for, if I've got this right, have for the first time done better than in-person teams. That's always been the other way around. So I think that there is some kind of recalibration and just like adaptation and evolution that workforces and human teams are capable of. That's really remarkable. And so, you're like, this is the face-to-face today. I rarely have so direct a face-to-face conversation with somebody in the hall as I do with somebody on screen like this. I mean, this is really a very direct sort of encounter. In the hall, there's always a little bit of shilly-shallying around. There's a little bit more theatrical space to play in. And, you can kind of come alongside somebody and look at the thing they're looking at, or, you might avert your gaze. You often do. But here it's just like it's actually kind of exhausting, right? If you do this all the time, you're like on and full on direct. The only strangeness that I can't get away from in remote conversation like this is that in order to look you in the eye, so to speak, I have to look away from your eyes. I have to look at the webcam, the little green dot. And so that's a sort of perpetual strangeness in remote meetings. How do you deal with that, by the way? Do you just sort of change focus, or what do you do?
Yeah, I struggle with it. I mean, you've seen my eyes darting all over the place probably as we've been talking today. I've tried a few things. So there was one that I had like a really small camera with a little like suction cup on it, so you can stick it on the screen. Huh. So you just put it wherever the eyes are, and then you just look at the camera, and it's which is a great idea in theory, but in practice, the technology wasn't there. It was a really unreliable camera. It always fogged up as well, and it kept falling off the screen as well, which was quite annoying. So I gave up with that. So now I've got a camera on a boom arm that's in the middle of the screen-ish.
Okay.
But if I put it any lower, then I'll be looking down on you, and that's even worse. So it's kind of a unhappy medium at the moment.
Yeah. I've had a number of podcasters tell me, I'm not going to be looking at you because I'm taking some notes right now. So, forgive me when I look away from the camera. I'm just like jotting some thoughts as we go. So,
well, at least they tell you.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had a few people recently have recommended getting a teleprompter, and then you just put it in front of the camera and you just look straight through it, which I might do in a little while. A few months,
look into
maybe.
that too.
because it does matter, and I agree with you. That's the one bit of weird I haven't quite got away from either.
Mm-hmm.
It's the eye contact thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, like, you're right, in person, you don't sit there fully focused eye contact all the way through a conversation, do you? And if you did, people would think you're weird. So, it's an odd one.
Yes. I once was working with a scholar on the practice of public speaking and just like eye contact during public speaking. And there are some people who, when they speak, will take on this sort of vampire gaze and look at people, and it's really uncanny and it's not desirable. So I sometimes have to help students to, like, kill the vampire, like distribute your gaze, look around. That's what humans do. So, yeah.
That reminds me of that episode of Friends. Have you seen that where Ross is practicing the speech?
No, I would love to see that.
So he does exactly that, because they tell him, look, you can't just look at your notes. You've got to meet people's eyes. You've got to engage with the audience a bit. So he does this thing where he has the notes in front of him and he'll read a sentence and then go,
yeah.
Eye contact with everyone around the room, like really fierce.
Thank you for that reference. I'll have to make use of that in class.
Showing my age there, I think. But
good stuff.
We were talking about time earlier. I've totally lost track of it. We've been going an hour and it doesn't feel like it. So, are you good time-wise? Can we do a couple more questions, or do you need to?
Of course, we can do a couple more. Yep.
Okay, so bit more of a leadership theme to these ones then. And the first one, I'm going to pick what I think is the most interesting question in terms of the answer that I tend to get. And that is, what's been your best experience in your career so far of being led?
That question. It's not a scarcity question. It's an abundance question. I think I had a peculiar experience of being led by someone who had been a very close friend. So I was in an organization. This friend left the organization, returned later at the senior level management. And so in two ways, I was of two minds about this. On the one hand, I was delighted to have my friend back in the organization. We were quite close, or we had been quite close. But when this guy took a senior level position, I couldn't interact with him. I couldn't just chat with him anytime I wanted to, as I had been able to before when we'd been more on a level plane. So that was hard for me. But the very things that had drawn me to him as a friend, his name was Aaron, made him a very good leader. And so our relationship definitely changed. We had far fewer occasions where we could just sit and chew the fat and enjoy the laughter that was so important to our relationship. Far fewer times. But the expansiveness of mind and the hilarity of communication and the just kind of deftness that had made me really admire him as a friend, made him a great administrator. He was and is someone who was able to move between the very close details, the budgetary matters of leadership, and also to manage the sort of human dimensions of the work. So I found myself in a bit of a paradox. I missed the guy, but the things that made me miss him also made him a very good leader.
That's a very difficult situation potentially. So it's pleasing to hear that it went well and there was a good outcome.
For me it did. Yeah.
Thinking about that from his perspective, that could have been really quite daunting, coming in to take a leadership position over a close friend and not knowing, because a less scrupulous person than you might have tried to take advantage of that situation, for example.
Yeah, well, I guess we were all too busy, but we were all too busy to leverage the situation. But you're right. Yeah. People do leverage. I have a co-researcher who's a nonprofit leader in Indianapolis, and one of the things he talks about, he's a Black American, and one of the things he talks about most frequently is just the role of friendship in his work. And I asked him once, like, friendship seems like such an interpersonal thing. Like, why is it so, in a way, societally and politically important? And he's like, well, all these corporations, all these institutions, they run on friendship. It's not always apparent, but friendships are always at play. And so, and not always for good, honestly. They can be quite exclusive. And so I think you're right to point to some of the tricky dynamics of having a friend who takes leadership in an organization.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, it feels like that's about trust, isn't it? That's why that is such a common thing, because who do you trust most? Your friends, your family.
Yes, right.
But then also, I don't know, maybe that is, as we say, taken advantage of. So an interesting story that I would share, which was kind of the opposite experience. So I think, again, there's something in that, where there was a guy who, he was basically managing me earlier in my career, and then he left. And then a few years later, he came back, and we ended up being colleagues at the same level, if you like. And we ended up being quite good friends. Like, we still talk today, even though we haven't worked together for 5 or 6 years. Trying to remember what year it is. It's 2025, isn't it? Yeah, 6 years. And that's quite an interesting one as well, because had he not left, had we stayed in that same organisation, he would have always had that position of seniority, and that friendship might have never happened. So, I guess it goes both ways, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's remarkable. That's remarkable. I think you were saying you were commending me for not being, unscrupulous and taking advantage of the friendship. I think I would want to praise your friend for saying, I'm going to be open to the possibilities of friendship here, even though I am in leadership. Leadership's lonely. And part of the reason it's lonely is we feel like we have to isolate in some way. And so, props to your friend. That's a good story. That's good.
Yeah, he's a good guy. Well, much as I'd love to keep going for another hour and 10 minutes, I don't want to steal too much of your time. So, last question for you. This is usually my favourite question. It's called Leadership Heroes.
Leadership Heroes.
So if you had to pick one person, and that can be anyone you like, anyone you can think of, like alive or dead, past or present, real or even fictitious, who would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be for you, and why?
Oh, that is a fun question. A few years ago, when our children were still at home, our second daughter let us know that if she could pick other parents, she would choose the Obamas, which felt like a leadership model that my wife and I couldn't live up to. But
just like unprompted, was it? Yeah.
We always joke that the Obamas are her other family. I think leaders I really, really admire. A leadership hero. I guess one thing I look for in a leader is someone who has a capability of humor. That, for some reason, is really, really important to me. And I don't know if that's because life is so sort of chaotic and random and zany that, if you're not full of humor, it feels like there's a sense in which you don't really get what's going on. So I guess I'd have to think about the leader heroes in my life as people who have the capacity to really cut loose and laugh. I've been fortunate to have a number of leaders like that, and I can think of other leaders in at least recent history where we have some sense of like their sense of humor, who really seem to have the capacity to laugh. And sometimes you get the sense from like reading people's writings that they were really very funny people. I've read a bit of the Protestant reformer Martin Luther, and he had some witticisms that were really, really earthy, and you wouldn't associate with a religious figure. So I think I'm going to pick Luther as a sort of a hero of leadership, somebody who had a strong sense of like individual accountability and responsibility, and who didn't necessarily want to lead a movement, but found himself, like, for good or ill, like leading a reformation, and did it with a lot of humor. Made a lot of mistakes, but I'm really grateful for the witticisms that have like trailed down through history from this guy. So there you go, David.
Well, you get bonus points because no one's chosen him before. So well done. And it's an interesting choice. I confess I don't know an awful lot about him, but your point about humour in leadership, I don't have enough words or jokes to express how much I agree with that. And I think for me, part of that is about the sort of person that I would willingly follow, if that makes sense, because I think if it's that sort of personality where they take themselves too seriously and there's no room for humour at work and all of that sort of mentality, that sort of individual, in my experience, is so depressing to work for. And exactly, yeah, and you fall asleep, you lose the plot, and you end up hating where you work, because as humans, we're not built, I think, to just be all serious all the time, or even like one track all the time. You've got to have that ability to change the mindset, change the mood, have a laugh about something, just do something silly for the sake of it, just for sanity, if nothing else. And so if you've got the sort of leader who cracks down on that and says, work is no place for this, that's a big red flag, I think.
Indeed.
Yeah. So yes, great example, great pick. Thank you for sharing. And that's pretty much all we've got time for. So the last thing I will ask you, though, Craig, is if any of the listeners want to know more about you and your work, perhaps get a copy of one of those books, where can they do? What's the address and the links and so on?
The book that I'm most keen to get on people's desks is called Digital Overwhelm, and that's a book about what digitality is doing to our workplaces. So Digital Overwhelm, wherever books are sold. But I do have a website that might open up some resources for people, and it's called The Mode Switch, themodeswitch.com. So check that out. I'm really interested in, as you heard, in being able to switch modes. And so that website does sort of channel people towards my writing. I have a weekly newsletter called The Mode Switch, but it also might be a chance for us to personally interact. So I'd love for people to stop by themodeswitch.com.
Excellent. And I will put links to those things in the show notes so everyone can find them easily.
Thank you, David.
Well, thank you, Craig, for being here. It's been a wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed it. I didn't expect it to go down the paths it has gone, but that is so often a sign of a great conversation, isn't it? So Thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm grateful too. And I hope you'll keep doing this really good work, David.
Well, I will keep doing it as long as I enjoy it. So I can't imagine I'll be stopping anytime soon. Craig, thank you again so much for that conversation. What a great one that was. Really enjoyed diving into those various topics in probably more detail than we originally planned, but I think that's just a sign that we were having fun. Time was flying, wasn't it? Which, again, seemed to have been a theme of the conversation. Listener and viewer, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you would like to learn more about Craig and the work that he does, do hit those links in the show notes. Sign up to his newsletter, get a copy of his book, learn more about his perspective on digital overwhelm and communication in the workplace, because there is definitely value to be had there. And if you would like to come along and join my online community, Integrity Leaders, it's built for new and first-time leaders, first-time business founders, leaders who are in a moment of transition in your career and you're struggling with some of those challenges that change presents to you as a leader. That's what the community is there for. Come and visit the website. There's a link somewhere. It should be above me probably, but it's www.leadingwithintegrity.co.uk. Have a browse around that website. There's plenty of links, lots of resources and materials there for you to have a look at, including a leadership quiz to help you identify your own leadership hero. Has a bit of a sci-fi theme, so hopefully that makes it even more appealing to you. And at various points across that website, there will be a green button which will take you to the sign up page for Integrity Leaders. There's also a link to my calendar on that page. So if you have any questions or you'd like to know more, or you just want to meet me and have a chat before you join the community, do feel free to book a time in on my calendar. And I look forward to meeting you and having a conversation and welcoming you into the community. Thank you so much for being with us, for listening today. Really appreciate your time and attention as always. Happy International Leadership Week. And I hope you'll join me again for our second bonus episode of the week, which will be coming out on Friday afternoon, and then back again next week. I'll be talking with Dr. Tom Collins about his take on leadership, his various conversations with 4-star generals and admirals, and the differences and similarities he sees between leadership in the military and leadership in healthcare, and all sorts of other leadership related topics besides. It's a really great conversation, that one, and not one you want to miss. And until then, be a leader, not a boss.